I'm Todd Maddox. I'm the VP of Research at Applied VR. I am a former academic. I have a PhD in psychology. I'm not a clinician, don't have a clinical psychology PhD. I have a basic science psychology PhD. I spent 25 years as a college professor, um, almost 20 of that at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Psychology, studying basically how the human brain learns. Studying the multiple learning centers in the brain, understanding what neurotransmitters sort of drive learning and unlearning in these different centers. I'm going to talk a lot about that, throughout these interactions that we have when we talk about immersive therapeutics. We talk about therapy, the fact that therapy is learning and unlearning. I mean, it's right up my alley. I've been studying this stuff for a few decades. So for the last 5 years, I've been working to develop Reliever. And help roll it out. It's been an absolute joy doing this work. I've had amazing discussions with product engineers and VR content creators, really getting into the weeds, and spending lots of time with pain psychologists and healthcare professionals who are on the front line helping patients who are really suffering. We talk about this concept of immersive therapeutics, and I mean it's a cool term, right? But like, what is it? So even though it's two words, immersive and therapeutics, there's a lot that goes into this. So let me try to unpack this. Let me first talk about the therapeutic component. Like, what is therapy? Okay. And, on the one hand, it's like we all sort of know. On the other hand, like, let's dive into what this really means. The goal of therapy, in particular non-pharmacologic, right? So we're talking about non-pharmacologic therapies, is to help a patient unlearn maladaptive either thought patterns or behaviors and replace those maladaptive thoughts and behaviors with adaptive thoughts and behaviors. So basically, therapy is about unlearning negative things and learning positive things. And that's, it's simple, and yet it there's a lot to that, because learning and unlearning involves structural and functional changes in the brain. Okay, so with therapy, we're literally working to change the way the brain is structured and the way the brain processes. That's big. Um, Sort of related kind of side note, there's a really famous physicist. This guy's name is Albert Einstein, right? And we've all heard of Albert Einstein. We've heard of like special relativity and general relativity. And let's face it, we don't really know what that is unless we're physicists. But it turns out he actually knew a lot about learning. And he has a quote that I just love. So, quote from Albert Einstein: "Learning is an experience. Everything else is just information." Okay, two simple sentences, but they're really, really compelling. Learning is an experience. In other words, we learn best, and on the flip side, we unlearn best through experience. What does that really mean? Learning is broadly distributed across the brain. If you ask the average Joe on the street, what does it mean to learn? They're going to talk about, oh, I read a textbook, or I go to a website and I gather information. And that's great. And we're really good at that as human beings. But information is processed only by one system in the brain, one learning system in the brain called the cognitive learning system. And that entails the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind your forehead. That's where short-term learning processes happen, cognitive learning processes happen. And then once they're sort of rehearsed enough, they end up in long-term memory. So we have lots of information stored in long-term memory. But again, that's information, and that's only one learning system in the brain. There are three other learning systems in the brain that I would argue, and our friend Albert would argue, are really, really important. Let's start with the experiential learning system. Learning is an experience. So what do we mean by that? The experiential learning system is all of the sensory and perceptual context around the learning process. So, like if you're an athlete or if you're a surgeon, or really any kind of learning, rock climbing, whatever. You have an environmental context around you. So there's sights, there's sounds, there's smells, there's tactile. That is all context within which you can it's a foundation or a scaffolding upon which you can build learning, that you can add additional information. The experiential learning system encompasses, again, it's the sensory and perceptual processing. So it's the visual processing areas in the brain, which are in the back of the brain, the auditory, the tactile, the olfactory, which are sort of back and sides of the brain. So that's the experiential learning center. And again, learning is an experience. So you really need to engage those centers. And again, this is all in the interest of therapy. I'm talking about therapy. I'm just doing a deep dive on learning here. There are two other learning systems that are critical. We talked about therapy as replacing maladaptive thoughts and habits with adaptive thoughts and habits. Habits are skills, they're behaviors. There's a behavioral learning center in the brain. It's deep down inside your brain. It's what we call a subcortical brain system. It's in what's called the striatum. Whoop-de-doo. That's not super important for this conversation. But what happens is, so again, let's take sports. Let's say you play volleyball and you've read all the books on how to be a great setter. Cool. So you have that cognitive information and you can pass a test and get 100%. Does that mean you know how to set? No. Setting involves actually doing it. In other words, being in an environmental context, watching the ball, gauging its movements and everything, getting your hands just right, contacting it just right. You don't have a double hit and all this. And if you do it well, you're going to get rewarded. You're going to see, oh, I did it well. This was right in this environmental context. You're going to get dopamine release into the striatum, into those behavioral learning centers, so that next time you're in a similar context, you're going to generate that same behavior. Okay, so behavioral learning is critical. Behavior change is the gold standard in healthcare, and certainly when it comes to therapy. The fourth learning system is called the emotional learning system. So this is all that sort of motivational context around the learning. Things like stress and anxiety are part of that motivational system. And interestingly, stress and anxiety actually downregulate cognitive processing. So it hurts information processing. Okay, so again, apologies for being a little bit long-winded here, but the point is learning is broadly distributed across the brain. Learning is best through experience. Therapy is about learning. Okay, so I got the second part of the immersive therapeutic piece. Now, what do we mean by immersive? Well, what we really want is to deliver therapy in a way that broadly distributes across the brain, across those learning centers. How can we do that? Enter devices like virtual reality. A virtual reality headset, you put it over your eyes, and you are now immersed in a new environment. Now, you can be immersed in a first-person shooter environment and play games. We could talk about that all day. Or you can be immersed in some therapeutic environment where it is providing you as therapy, but unlike reading about the therapy, you're experiencing the therapy. Learning is an experience, back to Einstein. So virtual reality delivered therapy, that is a type of immersive therapeutic, is delivering therapy in a way that you're broadly spreading that therapeutic value across the brain. I cannot emphasize how innovative this is and how important this is, because what this means is you can not only speed therapeutic change, make therapy happen faster in the interest of a patient, but it's also going to be more effective. So that's really, really key. Now, let me talk a little bit about, so you might say, okay, that's interesting. Okay, so a virtual reality, like you talked about this immersion component, there's this sense of presence. That is, there's this sense that you're in this therapeutic environment. Yeah, you're in your house, on your couch, but you feel like you're somewhere else. You feel like you're in this therapeutic environment because that's what your brain is telling you. How does this contrast with sort of mobile app-based therapy, let's say? And I want to be clear, mobile app-based therapy has, lots of uses and lots of advantages. But a mobile app-based therapy only engages the cognitive system. And you're trying to learn and gain that therapeutic value and change behavior through cognition. That just doesn't work very well. Whereas with an immersive therapeutic, you're directly engaging those centers. So let me just give you one example. Um, Deep breathing techniques, breathing relaxation techniques are really, really valuable for lots of mental health conditions and certainly for chronic pain, which is what we do at Apply VR. So there's a couple ways I can learn breathing. One is I could open up a mobile app and I could read, okay, you breathe in and for over 6 seconds, and then you hold it for 4 seconds, and then you breathe out for 8 seconds or whatever. There's lots of different breathing variants. So you're reading that, and then you're trying to emulate it, right? You're trying to follow those instructions. So you're trying to learn something. You're trying to change behavior through cognition. It can work, you know, but for a lot of people, it doesn't. They really struggle. Now imagine an immersive therapeutic way of learning uh, these deep breathing techniques. I put you in VR. There is an environment in front of you. Let's say it's kind of a desert scape almost. It's a dead trees in front of you. There's bushes, there's grass. Everything's dead. Not really appealing. There's a voiceover telling you, and it's very soothing. The voiceover is very relaxing, and it's talking to you about breathing and how slowing your breathing can be really good for helping you mitigate pain. And of course, the voiceover is very soothing, so you're just kind of naturally slowing your breathing. The VR device is capturing your breathing pattern and actually representing it in the environment that you're in. So you're actually and this is content that we have in our therapy. These little purple orbs are going out into that environment, and they're emulating your breathing pattern. As your breathing pattern slows, that environment in front of you starts to flourish. The tree starts to grow. The bushes start to grow. The grass starts to grow. It's rewarding. You're getting rewarded for changing your breathing pattern directly. You're directly engaging those behavioral learning centers in the brain. You're going to learn breathing really fast that way. And guess what? You're not even going to really know what kind of breathing it is. Doesn't matter. You don't need to know it cognitively. You need to know it behaviorally. So that's one of the classic examples. And there's many others that we can talk about. One last thing I want to talk about under the immersive therapeutic section here. So, cool. 3D immersive is better than 2D because it broadly engages all these centers in the brain. That's what we went over, the four learning centers and such. There's really an added bonus here, and this is one of the things I'm most excited about immersive therapeutics, and that is that the content can be built to be really high quality content presented consistently in the device. Everybody gets the same high quality content, right? We know when you have a therapist, sometimes you have a good therapist or a bad therapist, or you just don't jibe with them, or you jibe with them really well. Well, with this kind of content, it's consistent, it's high quality, and it's in the comfort of your own home. So the lift is really low. You're going to be more likely to engage in the therapy, less likely to, miss therapeutic sessions and such. So it's really a huge win. Immersive therapeutics, therapy is about learning and unlearning. Learning and unlearning is broadly distributed across the brain. The best way to broadly distribute that therapeutic value across the brain is with some kind of an immersive device like VR delivered therapy. Because that optimizes the breadth of, spreading the wealth of the learning, I call it, or spreading the wealth of that therapy. It leads to faster therapeutic change and stronger therapeutic change. We actually have data on that. It's better than your 2D because you're engaging all those centers as opposed to just the cognitive system. I gave you the breathing example. And then, of course, you can do this in the comfort of your own home. And it's very high quality, consistent content. So lots of wins across the board. Okay, great. So hey, we've spent a bit of time talking about this concept of immersive therapeutics. uh, as a general category of therapy in healthcare. And we've talked about the numerous advantages. Um, even dove a little bit into the neuroscience and the brain science behind this, which, really cool, really, really fascinating. So let's now talk about a specific example of an immersive therapeutic. And this is one that I've had the honor of being part of developing and testing empirically. This is called what we call Reliever. This is an FDA-authorized therapy for chronic lower back pain. So I want to kind of walk you through some of the high points around the development of Reliever and such. So to start, let's set Reliever aside for a second. Okay, so let's set the virtual reality delivered therapy aside for a second. The starting point for building this new therapy in this new product was to go to the literature, the scientific literature. There are decades of just absolutely beautiful research on non-pharmacologic therapies for chronic low back pain and frankly for other kinds of pain and for mental health, et cetera. And we'll touch on some of that in a bit. But for chronic low back pain, things like cognitive behavior therapy, deep breathing, meditation, mindfulness, pain education, all of these things have been studied. Tons of randomized control trials, so really, really powerful experimental scientific studies that have shown that these therapies work. Okay. Um, and there's the way we define something is that it works is we run a study, we compute something called an effect size. It's a statistic. Not going to dive into the details of that, but the bottom line is the larger the effect size, the more effective the therapy. And all of these therapies, cognitive behavior therapy, deep breathing, meditation, mindfulness, pain education, they work. They could work better, but they could certainly be the worst. So, they're sort of middle of the road. They work. Um, they're great. That was the starting point for developing Reliever. The innovation of the development of Reliever is not those therapies. They already existed. It was basically taking experts on those therapies, pain psychologists in particular, but pain scientists in general. And we essentially had them sit down with virtual reality content creators. These are two very disparate groups of individuals, right? And basically said, hey, look, here's the goal. VR content creators, I want you to build VR content. And remember, harken back to our discussion about immersive therapeutics. This is that content that could be broadly presented in a VR device that broadly distributes across all those learning centers in the brain. I want you to build VR content that captures as many of the foundational principles of cognitive behavior therapy as you can. I want you to build VR content that captures foundational principles of deep breathing, of meditation, of mindfulness. I want you to build VR content around pain education. And, lots of fits and starts, very, very iterative. But at the end of that process, we then had virtual reality content that captured those foundational principles. Huge, huge win because now we can present those therapies that have been studied for decades that we know work, but now we can present them in VR through this immersive therapeutic device that we believe is going to speed therapeutic change and actually lead to more highly clinically effective therapeutic change. So again, a win-win. Okay, so we have this content. Great. We then sat down with pain experts, one in particular, Beth Darnall, who's at Stanford, who's been studying chronic pain for several decades. She's world-renowned, fantastic individual, wonderful person to work with. She helped us build out our therapy. What we did with Beth's help was we built a fixed sequence therapy. In other words, we took that VR content that captured those foundational principles and we put it together in a sequence. And the goal of that sequence was to space out the foundational principles. So basically, spaced repetition is the key. The goal of the therapy is to build skills and habits in the patient. Remember, replace maladaptive thoughts and behaviors with adaptive thoughts and behaviors. So build those skills and habits in the patient that allow them to manage their pain and to cope with their pain. In other words, give them tools in their toolbox so that once they're not in VR, once they've completed the therapy, they now have the skills and habits that is that structural and functional change in their brain so that they can cope with their pain. To build skills and habits, the key foundation is spaced repetition. So you need to repeat processes to learn and to make certain kind of breathing a habit. You have to repeat that learning, that breathing training. And you don't just repeat it back to back to back. It needs to be spaced out over time. That's why we had a fixed sequence, not mix and match, not you patient, you decide what you want to do today, but rather here's the therapeutic journey that you need to go through in this particular order, spaced repetition to build those skills and habits. So we built that out. It's a 56-session therapy. We conducted a randomized control trial, and I'm going to talk about that later. We ran a randomized control trial. We got beautiful data, analyzed all the data. We wrote up a 200-page report, essentially, that we submitted to the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA went through our report. They came back with lots of questions. We interacted with them. Basically, they have a review process. It's much like publishing a scientific manuscript, honestly. They came back with questions. We came back with answers. And at the end of the process, they were like, yep, we're satisfied. This is safe. It's effective. It works. They stamped it with their approval. And it is an FDA-authorized therapy. In other words, healthcare professionals can prescribe this therapy, this non-pharmacological skill-based therapy for chronic low back pain. A little bit more about the experiences. So the duration, so the dosage, so it's 56 sessions. We recommend that people complete one session per day. So if you completed one session per day, you'd be done in 56 days, which is 8 weeks. We give people more time than that. We generally send the device out for 12 weeks. People have lives they have to live. We get that. We'd rather have people get through the whole program over 12 weeks than push on them to get it done in 8 weeks or not get it done in 8 weeks. Each experience ranges from about 2 to 15 minutes with an average duration of 6 minutes. And many people ask us, where does 6 minutes come from? Look, it's somewhat arbitrary, but actually not really. We don't want too big a lift on people. We don't want to tell them, hey, you need to be in VR for 45 minutes today. People have busy lives. They're not going to do it. But we also don't want them just to be in VR for 30 seconds or a minute or, 2 minutes. They're not going to get enough bang for the buck. And that 2 to 15 minute range with an average of 6 has been kind of a sweet spot. And I know it's a sweet spot because when I look at engagement data, which we'll talk a little bit about more later, people are engaging with the therapy. People are using the device way more than we see in the digital therapeutic field, honestly. The program is really engaging. People like it, and they're using it. You're not going to get any value out of VR-delivered therapy if the VR device sits on your table. You have to engage with it. So 2 to 15 minutes, 6 minutes a day seems to be a nice sweet spot that gives people enough engagement but isn't too big of a lift. So we've talked about what immersive therapeutics are. Did a little bit of a dive into the neuroscience of learning and how therapy is really about learning and, why VR delivered therapies have so much value because they can engage all those learning centers in the brain in the interest of therapy, which is just absolutely a huge innovation. We've talked a bit about one specific immersive therapeutic that, again, I've had the privilege of being involved in developing and testing called RelieVR, which is now an FDA-authorized non-pharmacologic therapy for chronic low back pain, so it could be prescribed by healthcare professionals. What I want to do now is talk about the empirical evidence in support of RelieVR. So, I have letters after my name, PhD, and so I have some authority or, whatever. But hey, don't believe me. I can tell you it works, but don't believe me. You be convinced by data, right? The FDA requires that, which is why FDA authorization for reliever was such a huge lift. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of money, but it's important for the Food and Drug Administration to not just believe me, but to be convinced with data. So we had to run studies to test the safety and effectiveness of reliever. And the studies that we ran are called randomized control trials. So the key is that you have to randomize the assignment of your patients to which therapy they're going to get. So basically, in our study, we had our reliever group, we had our control group, and I'm going to talk about the control group in a second because we had a really, really good control. I'm really proud of the control that we used. Basically, we have a patient come in, we flip a coin. If it comes up heads, they go in the reliever group. If it comes up tails, they go into the control group. So everybody has a 50% chance of being in the reliever or the control. That's what randomized means. So it's randomized and it's controlled trial, meaning experiment. Okay, so let me talk about the control group, because the goal of a randomized control trial is that you want your therapeutic group and your control group to be identical in every respect possible, except the aspect of the therapy that you believe is causal. That is, that you believe is what causes the important change. So, if I give half of my people a VR headset that has reliever, and the other half of my people, I give them a mobile device with music on it, and reliever's better than the mobile device, is it because of reliever? Maybe. But maybe it's because reliever's in this cool VR headset and people got this cool VR headset and it doesn't matter what's in it. It just works better because it's this cool VR headset versus this mobile device. So that's not a good rigorous control. And we were aware of this. So our control group got the same exact VR headset as our reliever group. So we controlled the novelty of virtual reality. And everybody got the same headset. They were both told it was a therapy. For both groups, it was 56 sessions with an average duration of about 6 minutes per session. So again, everything's equal. All this stuff is equal. Now the critical differences. The reliever group got the reliever program, which has the therapeutic foundations. It's immersive and three-dimensional. The control group got a VR headset. Essentially, it looked like a big screen TV inside the headset, so it was non-immersive. It was more 2D, and instead of getting the therapeutic stuff, it was basically nature footage. Now, actually, nature footage is relaxing. It actually has some therapeutic value, which makes sense when you really think about it. But what a great control group. What a rigorous control, because the only difference is the immersive 3D, therapeutic component. That's the way you run a good randomized control trial. And what that allows you to do when you have a control group, if your reliever group is better than your control group statistically, you can say that difference is due to, that is, it is caused by the aspects of reliever that are different from control. In other words, that it's 3D, immersive, and has this therapeutic content. To be able to draw cause-effect inference is the gold standard in science. And with the control group that we utilize in these studies, we're able to draw that cause-effect inference, which again is really big and really important. Okay. We ran 2 randomized control trials. Our first randomized control trial was sort of a small sample. We had about 200 people, so about 100 people in reliever, about 100 people in our what we call sham VR, our control group. It was very much an opportunity sample. We advertised through Facebook and through pain societies and such. We actually ran this during COVID. very much an opportunity sample in a sense that we took anybody who met our inclusion criteria around chronic low back pain, and it ended up being fairly homogeneous group, basically middle-aged white women. We got really strong results from that study. We had clinically meaningful reductions in pain intensity. So we would ask people on a scale from 0 to 10, how intense is your pain? Where 0 is, I don't have any pain, feel great, to 10 is, I'm dying here. I can't think about anything else. This is horrible. So we would collect those pain ratings before they got reliever or sham, and then they complete the 56 sessions, and then we ask them the same question afterwards. So that's pain intensity. We then asked a number of questions around pain interference. How much does your pain interfere with activity, with sleep, with mood, with stress? We know those are all comorbid with chronic pain. It was important to look at pain intensity. So in that 200-patient trial, 2 results stood out with respect to pain intensity and pain interference. First, in the reliever group, on average, we had at least a 2-point reduction in pain intensity and at least a 2-point reduction in pain interference. 2-point reduction is critical because that is defined by all the experts in the field of pain as a clinically meaningful reduction. What does it mean to be clinically meaningful? Basically, it means that it significantly improves a patient's quality of life. So a patient might say at the end of therapy, pain does still interfere with my sleep, but not as much as it did before I did reliever. Okay, so it's a clinically meaningful reduction. So that's the first result. Reliever is leading to clinically meaningful reductions in pain intensity and pain interference, actually across activity, sleep, mood, and stress. So huge win. The second point is that although the sham group did have pain reductions, the pain reductions for the sham group were statistically smaller than the pain reductions for the reliever group. In other words, the reliever group had statistically larger reductions in pain intensity and pain interference to the control group, which again allows us to draw cause-effect inference and say, hey, what's driving this effect is the immersive 3D quality of reliever and the therapies that are built into it. So that's the clinical effectiveness. We're able to reduce pain intensity and pain interference. How did it work, right? Like, why did that work? Well, and I sort of alluded to this earlier when I talk about the therapy, it's really engaging. We're asking people to complete 1 session per day. Okay, so in a week, if you're doing the therapy if you're on track, every week you're going to complete 7 sessions. In our randomized control trial, on average, people were completing just over 5 sessions per week. That's really, really good. That's especially good for a digital therapeutic, meaning a therapy delivered through some digital medium. And I think that follows for a couple of reasons. One, it's working. People are feeling the effects. Like, wow, I'm feeling better. This is working, and we get this anecdotally from patients all the time. Like, wow, it's just that breathing is great. It's really helping me. I love this. I'm going to keep using it. So they're using it a lot, right? So it's really engaging. Over 5 sessions per week, which again is just off the charts, high engagement for a digital therapeutic. The device is also really easy to use. And I want to talk a little bit about this. A VR headset, you put it on your head. And for those of you that have used, VR headsets, sometimes you can get like stuck. I call it, going down a rabbit hole. I am not the most technologically savvy individual on the planet Earth. I'm not, never have been. I'm older. This device is super easy to use. It's easy to use because the engineering team took this piece of hardware that's an off-the-shelf VR headset, and basically we're able to get access to the software on what they call the back end. Basically, able to get access to the software so that they can modify to make it really easy to navigate. It's all gaze-based. There's no controllers. You don't have to use your hands. You just stare at the start button and the therapy starts. There's also not a lot of other stuff on it. On your mobile phone, you have 20 apps. In this device, it's reliever. That's it. So you don't get stuck going down rabbit holes. It's really usable. And in fact, again, don't believe me, we actually used a measure called the system usability scale to measure the usability of the device. And what's cool is this measure is benchmarked against all kinds of things out there. So like reliever is easier to use than a toaster. It's easier to use than a microwave. It's easier to use than Google. Like it's really, really easy to use. So it's easy to use. People don't get stuck in a rabbit hole. So they're able to use it and they're finding that it's really engaging and it's helping. So they're not leaving it on their table. They're using it and it's leading to pain reductions. Huge. That's a trifecta. It's effective. People engage with it and it's easy to use. And those all go together. Okay. Again, this is the first randomized control trial we ran. We ran so we took those data and we wrote up the 200-page report I talked about before, basically what we called a de novo submission to FDA as a Class 2 medical device. And those are the data they scrutinized. We had a lot of back and forth with them, answered a lot of questions, and ultimately led to FDA authorization. We immediately started our second randomized control trial. We wanted a bigger sample and we wanted a more diverse sample. Remember that original trial, we call it our pivotal trial. It was about 200 patients that were mostly white middle-aged women. Our post-launch trial had 1,100 patients, and we went to a lot of time and effort to make sure that we had a better balance of gender, a better balance of age. So we had breadth across age and race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. So we had a much more representative sample, which is key. A good scientist will look at that first trial and go, this is nice. The data are good. Your sample, not as diverse as I'd like, but okay. And I never believe one study you've got to replicate. You've got to run it again. And that's what we've done. And at the highest level, bottom line, we replicated all the results. We got 2-point reductions. People used the device around 5 sessions per week. And we got really, really high system usability. So we basically replicated in this much more diverse sample, which is great. So we now have 2 randomized control trials showing essentially the same result, again, in chronic low back pain patients. Okay, and that was our primary goal. We're interested in reducing pain intensity and pain interference, but we know that chronic pain is comorbid with all kinds of things. Chronic pain patients tend to be more anxious. They tend to be more depressed. They tend to not sleep as well, and they tend to not be as physically mobile. They don't move around as much. And we wanted to measure those, what we call secondary outcomes as well. So we measured, before people started the therapy, we got measures of depression, anxiety, sleep, and physical function. And then we measured those after the trial was over. And the bottom line is we saw reductions in all of those. In chronic low back pain patients. So I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying reliever is a therapy for major depression. I'm not saying reliever is a therapy for anxiety. I actually think it would work in those cases, but I would need data to support that. That's a speculation on my part. But we have shown that in chronic low back pain patients, not only do we get reductions in pain intensity and pain interference, but we see these secondary advantages: less anxiety, less depression, better sleep, more mobile. Okay, that's at the end of treatment. Your first question should be, great, what about 2 months later? What about 6 months later? What about a year later? Todd, you told me that this builds skills and habits that I can use outside of VR. So once I haven't had the device, what's going to happen? Great question. What we did was we tracked people in both of these trials out to 2 years post-treatment. In other words, we tracked people out to 2 years after they sent us back the device. A few things to say about this. The pain reductions were lower at 2 years out than they were at end of treatment. In fact, and you saw a decline. At 6 months, they're a little lower. At 12 months, they're a little bit lower. At 24 months, they're even a little bit lower. Okay, which you would expect. But they're still strong. They weren't always 2 points, but in many cases, we still had 2-point reductions, which is clinically meaningful. And they were always better than for the sham group. Okay, let's just talk about that second study, the one with 1,100 people in it. The beauty of a large study like that is that we can start doing what we call subgroup analysis. Um, when we're out talking to healthcare professionals about reliever and educating them and educating patients, we get lots of really, really good questions. And the great thing about having a giant data set is instead of me going, well, I think the answer to your question is this, I'll say, great question. Let me go back to my data and see if I can answer that for you. And that's what we've done. And so we've done a lot of what we call secondary analyses. So I want to talk about a little bit of the secondary analyses that we've conducted. I'm going to start with what I think is probably, frankly, other than the basic results from those trials, is probably the most important finding that we've observed. I want to talk about what's called high impact chronic pain. So again, we're interested in chronic pain patients, chronic low back pain patients in particular. About 25% of chronic pain patients are defined as what's called high impact chronic pain. And basically, high impact chronic pain patients are people whose pain scores are they're a 7 or greater on a 0 to 10-point scale. Okay, so they're really suffering. And because they're really suffering so much, they're not able to work or not able to do chores or not able to go to school. They're really suffering. Critically, they're really high healthcare utilizers. Obviously, they're looking for solutions. They're trying everything. They're in the ER a lot. They're getting injections. They're unfortunately using lots of opiates just to try to keep their head above water. So a question that was asked of us and we asked of our data was, how does reliever work for high impact chronic pain patients relative to lower impact chronic pain patients? So what I did is I went back to my almost 600 reliever patients and I divided them up into high and low impact chronic pain by looking at their pain score. Those with a 7 or above are high impact chronic pain. Those with less than 7 are lower impact chronic pain. And I looked at the pain reductions for the two groups. Bottom line, both groups saw strong pain reductions, but we actually saw larger pain reductions for the high impact chronic pain group. Statistically larger. Reliever is working statistically better for high impact chronic pain patients than it is for lower impact chronic pain patients. And that effect is durable, again, out to 2 years. So it's working really well for these folks. In fact, if we just look at the high impact chronic pain patients, a question that we asked was, what do they look like at the end of treatment? What are their scores at the end of treatment? Are they still a high impact chronic pain patient, but their pain scores have gone down? Or have they crossed that threshold and they're now a lower impact chronic pain patient? We have the high impact chronic pain patients. At the end of treatment, at the end of reliever, 70% of the people who are high impact chronic pain before they got reliever are now lower impact chronic pain patients. 70%. And it only drops to 67% at 2 years. In other words, reliever is turning high impact chronic pain patients into lower impact chronic pain patients, meaning their quality of life is a lot better. They're probably able to work, do their chores, go to school. They're also not ending up at the ER as much. They're not getting as many injections, those kinds of things, right? We're actually literally turning high impact chronic pain patients into lower impact chronic pain patients. Huge win. I can speculate on why that's the case, and maybe we'll leave that for another episode here. But really nice finding. And again, it wasn't me speculating; it was me going to data to help answer that question. A few other questions that we've gotten from folks. What about gender? What about race and ethnicity? What about age? Older folks versus younger folks. What about people who are high socioeconomic status versus lower socioeconomic status? All great questions. So I was able to carve our data up, male versus female, 65 and older versus under 65, Caucasian, African American, Asian American, lower socioeconomic status, high socioeconomic status. And I could look at clinical effectiveness, engagement, and usability of the device. The bottom line is none of it mattered. The program seems to work across the board. The one result that we found, and we actually got a lot of press for this, which is interesting, but it's kind of cool, was that older adults actually use the device more than younger adults. Now, younger adults were still using it a lot, but older adults are actually using it more. So um, the device is easy to use. They're getting a lot of bang for the buck. It's working. So those kind of demographic factors, not really an issue. I talked earlier about the fact that Reliever, if in the comfort of your own home, you can use the device. In fact, and I didn't allude to this earlier, but it doesn't need to be connected to Wi-Fi. It's a standalone device. You can connect it to Wi-Fi, and there's some use to that. In particular, we can track your usage. We can help you troubleshoot if you ever have any issues, but it doesn't need to be connected. So this is a perfect device to be sending out to the rural America, right? We know that rural healthcare is suffering, and we know that actually the prevalence of chronic low back pain is higher in rural America than in non-rural America. And this is a perfect device for that because there aren't as many healthcare professionals out there. But does it work? Does it work for rural folks versus urban folks? I don't see any reason that it wouldn't, but don't believe me. We went to our data. So we're able to look at people's zip codes. We can classify them as either rural versus urban. We found no differences. Actually, if anything, we found a greater effectiveness for rural folks. That we didn't have the statistical power to really test that. But at the highest level, no difference. It works for rural and urban just as well. So a real win. Another thing people have asked us is it better for somebody who's had chronic pain for, a decade versus somebody, early on who's only been in chronic pain for a year or so? Again, I see no reason it wouldn't work across the board, but don't believe me. I went back to the data. And what I did was I was able to bin the data. I was able to look at people who had had chronic pain for a year or less, 2 to 5 years, or 6+ years. Bottom line, again, really no differences. It's working across the board for everybody. And in fact, given that it's so easy to use and it's so low risk, healthcare professionals, those data have given people the confidence to prescribe it early, right? I mean, there's no downside, really no downside to getting it in people's hands early. One last finding that's really interesting. There's a construct in the pain field called pain catastrophizing. And the idea is that chronic pain patients differ in how much they kind of perseverate on their pain. Some people can kind of ignore it, and even though it hurts, they can, they're muddling through. And other people, they just can't get their mind off of it. They're what we call catastrophizers. They have high levels of pain catastrophization. What's really cool about this is, and I actually was talking to a doctor a couple days ago and his fellows about this, and he's like, "Oh yeah, we can tell a catastrophizer within 30 seconds just by talking to our patient." So it's really important. Like, how does reliever work for high pain catastrophizers? Some of these therapies don't seem to work as well for high pain catastrophizers as for lower pain catastrophizers, in particular, cognitive behavior therapy. So we looked at it with reliever, and we actually found greater pain reductions for high pain catastrophizers. And the people that I presented this to, the healthcare professionals, the pain specialists especially, super excited about this result because they've struggled to help their high pain catastrophizing patients. And now they have something that seems to actually work better for high pain catastrophizers. Again, I have my speculation on why this is the case. It's educated speculation, but I'll leave that for another discussion. This leads me to the second point I want to talk about, and this is something that we always get asked, and that is, well, what's next? You've got an FDA-authorized therapy for chronic low back pain that's working great. You have this follow-on Sustain that takes care of lots of, little things that maybe reliever doesn't do all by itself. But what's next? Well, sky's the limit. First thing is we want to expand the label beyond chronic low back pain. We pick chronic low back pain because it's the most prevalent form of chronic pain. But if you look at chronic musculoskeletal pain, so anything within the nociceptive pain pathway, there's absolutely no reason that this program shouldn't work there. And when I say absolutely no reason, I mean looking at literally the anatomy and the physiology of how pain is processed from localized areas into the brain. There's absolutely zero reason this shouldn't work for chronic knee pain or chronic shoulder pain, but we haven't tested that. So we want to expand the label to chronic musculoskeletal pain right away. We have data on fibromyalgia. We've already shown that it works in fibro, which is great. And then we want to start looking at some of these other, chronic regional pain, neuropathic pain, some of these other sort of types of pain, and we need to test that empirically. If you look at the therapies that people use for these other types of pain, they tend to be cognitive behavior therapy, deep breathing, meditation, mindfulness, which are foundational to reliever. So we're confident it should work there, but you've got to collect the data. Then you might say, "Oh, that's great. I mean, so you guys are going to cover brain, right on, pain, right on. That's super." But like, well, what else? Mental health, right? It's a mental health crisis in America right now, and it's getting worse. A lot of people with anxiety, a lot of people with stress, a lot of people with depression. Um, we want to build versions of reliever that expand into the mental health realm. Okay, cool. I understand the need. Why do you think reliever is going to work there? Well, because the foundational therapies, cognitive behavior therapy, deep breathing, meditation, mindfulness, that are used in chronic pain are the same therapies that are used very often in anxiety, in depression to help with sleep. So there's no reason that this therapy shouldn't work there. Now, we're probably going to have to switch some things up, right? Maybe for stress and anxiety, deep breathing really, really has a big impact. Well, then we might build a version of reliever that has more deep breathing in it for that application than we have with reliever. Cool. But the content is solid. The types of foundational therapies are solid. We're going to have to mix it up some, and it'll be an iterative process where we build what's called an MVP, or basically your minimum viable product, your starting point, and start testing it and iterating to optimize it. But that's sort of the roadmap. That's the future here. Uh, we want to start looking at biometrics. So there's, everybody has one of these smartwatches. Like, how can we incorporate that? Lots of directions that we can go there. So we've done a lot. Works in chronic low back pain, has these secondary positive impacts. We know why. We know a lot about the neurobiology here, but really the future is rosy, and there's a lot of really cool work to do.